Today I'd just like to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Chris Leithner. Dr. Chris Leithner is the director of a private investment company as well as an author of several books. His most recent is The Evil Princes of Martin Place, which discusses the Reserve Bank of Australia, the global financial crisis and the threat to Australia's liberty and prosperity. Steeped in the Misesian and Rothbardian as well as Hoppian tradition, Chris has over the years been a frequent guest of 612 ABC Radio with Steve Austin, foretelling the current economic errors of the day. Last year, Chris presented the Austro-Libertarian perspective at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas regarding the topic of let banks fail. Today he turns his sights to the charlatans of the economic world to discuss the general concept of the bankruptcy of mainstream economics. The specific talk of his title is Austerity. What austerity? Europe and the US desperately need genuine austerity, not the Faux austerity of the past several years. To tell us more, I'll hand it over to Chris.
Thank you, Michael, for the invitation. Can people in the back hear me reasonably well? And I'm not shouting too loud for folks in the front. Thank you. The title of my talk, as astute people like yourselves will see from the program, is a bit different from that which has been advertised. It's a more specific variant of the theme. Quite frankly, as I was going through and preparing a subject on the bankruptcy of mainstream economics, much of it was so patently obvious I think I'd be repeating things with which most of you would be already familiar. So I compressed the subject somewhat, or narrowed things to a slightly more specific topic. Several of my main points, happily, will dovetail with points that Jeffrey Tucker made roughly half an hour or so ago. So there's a happy convenience about that. Let me give you an overview. I'll make 3 or 4 main points. I'll draw a distinction. I'll define austerity, which most folks who use the term in the mainstream press don't define. I'll draw a distinction between what I call genuine austerity. It entails sharp decreases of the government's taxing and spending and a significant reduction of its debt. And I'll distinguish it from faux austerity or false austerity, which on the other hand entails an increase of the government's spending and debt. I recognise that the words for folks way in the back and the charts and the graphs, etc., they won't be particularly legible, so I'll give you a chef's guided tour. If anyone wants the paper, I'll make it available afterwards. But the critical distinction then between genuine and faux austerity or false austerity. Second point, have governments in the Western world actually implemented genuine austerity? The most recent incidence I could find of genuine real austerity was the US government during the Depression of 1920-1921. Few people have heard of it. I'll try to explain why that is, namely because it went away so quickly. And why did it go away so quickly? Because of genuine austerity. At no time since 2005, the data with which I'll blizzard you extend from 2005, at no time since then have governments in the EU, namely in Western Europe, or the US implemented genuine austerity. Instead, they've championed that false variant of austerity. There's an Australian nexus to this, or connection. Given these points of vulnerability, which I'll mention in the course of discussing things American and European, is Australian vulnerable? It seems to me it is vulnerable to a banking crisis in the same way that any country or any bank is vulnerable to a banking crisis. Today, Australia's banks are among the biggest in the world, barring virtually none. They're dangerously big for a country of Australia's size, bigger relative to GDP than were American Irish banks on the eve of the crisis that engulfed them beginning in 2007 into 2008 and 9. It seems to be when they eventually wobble, Australia's banks will require a bailout. When they get one, Australia's debt to GDP ratio, which, yes, at the moment, the Commonwealth's debt to GDP is indeed quite low relative to America or the EU. It'll zoom towards those levels that exist today. And well before that point, namely today, genuine austerity, as I define it, will be just as necessary in this country as it is in Europe and America. Okay. What is austerity? Before I proceed to that, just a bit of a summary overview, point with which you're probably familiar, that today the word austerity receives a very bad press. Journalists more or less denounce it, regard it as something as hideous and horrible, something to be avoided at virtually all cost. It's something that allegedly has been implemented in Europe, and it's begotten grievous sorts of results. It's made a bad situation worse. And more than that, here's a quote. There's a new book. It's called The Body Economic: Why Austerity Kills, Recession, Budget Battles, and the Politics of Life and Death, written by an economist and an epidemiologist, medico and an economist. And they reckon that there have been 10,000 additional suicides and up to 1 million extra cases of depression across Europe and America as a result of what they call austerity. And they go on, but austerity not just is economically bad, but they reckon it literally does kill people. In Australia, perhaps not to that extent, but the word austerity gets a sneering response from lots of politicians, none the least from our happily departed ex-leader Kevin Rudd. The day of the Commonwealth election, on the 7th of September, he penned, or one of his minders penned, an article in the Weekend Australian. The choice of the article, the choice is between the smart nation or an austere one. I'll give you the introductory paragraph. Voters in Australia, he reckoned, will be making a choice between fundamentally different visions of the future of our country. Labor's vision is for a country where every Australian has the right to a decent job, where all of our kids get the education they need. It's an Australia with one of the world's best health and hospital systems, which looks after its elderly and cares for those with disabilities. The Liberal National Coalition, allegedly, on the other hand, Tony Abbott's policies all boil down to one thing: cuts. He's planning billions of dollars of cuts, and you name it, in all the likely places. The contrast, as Rudd saw it, was between good, he didn't use the word, but I guess good profligacy and very bad austerity. In Europe, the distinction seems to be, if you follow, as many as you probably do, Paul Krugman's editorials and commentaries in the New York Times. First came the tremendously beneficial stimulus in the form of bailouts, etc. Then came the harmful austerity, and that's a theme I saw it in the paper. If he says it once, he says it a dozen times, and all along, indeed, a missive which I cite, Keynes was right. A phrase from John Maynard Keynes in 1937, quote, "The boom and not the slump is the right time for austerity at the Treasury." So the axiom, the foundation point for followers of Krugman, Keynesians of various sorts of description, is whatever you're doing, do more of it. Spend a lot, spend more. Go into debt, continue to go more into debt. The more, the merrier. A good summary position in Forbes magazine, Paul Roderick Gregory, not a Keynesian, I'm not sure what he is, but here's a good summary of the Keynesian position. Die-hard Keynesians, he said, bemoan the fact that, with few exceptions, the world's economies are drowning in the quicksand of austerity. I'll repeat that. Their contention, Keynesian contention, as we speak, the world's economies are drowning in the quicksand of austerity. They, meaning proponents of profligacy, I guess, preach that we need more government spending, more stimulus, not less. Northern Europe should bail out its less fortunate neighbours to the south, namely the Greeks, so that they can pay their teachers, public employees, they don't call them bureaucrats, that's bad speak, public employees, and continue generous transfers to the poor and the unemployed. So obviously anyone who opposes those sorts of things is clearly anti-poor, anti-unemployed. If not, Europe's south will remain mired in recession. In America, Keynesians entreat the skinflint Republicans to loosen the purse strings so that we can escape from subpar growth. They advise that Japan spend itself out of permanent stagnation and welcome recent steps in this direction, as if the Japanese somehow haven't spent enough, haven't built a sufficient number of bridges and tunnels and who knows what else. So that's the gist of the claim. I'm still getting towards my definition. Let me give you the counter with which you're probably familiar, but to help to set my scene. Keynesians see financial crises and economic busts as largely unpredictable events that governments must move heaven and earth to prevent, and if they can't prevent them, they must move heaven and earth in order to mitigate. Austrians, on the other hand, followers of Menger, of Mises, Hoppe, etc., Rothbard, and so on, explain crises and busts as an inevitable result of the unsustainable, because it's artificial, boom provoked by government intervention in general and central fractional reserve banks' excessive expansion of credit in particular. In a nutshell, bankers grant the worst loans during the superficially best times. For Austrians, the boom is not a blessing, it's a curse. The recession isn't a curse, it's a cure for the boom, for the misallocations of resources, for the dumb decisions born of poor, false signals that were emitted during the boom. The bigger the preceding artificial boom, say the Austrians, the more severe is going to be the consequent genuine bust. The recession's the hangover that follows the blinder. It's the cold turkey that's necessary, extraordinarily painful, yes, but it's necessary in order to kick the addiction to artificial credit. Another analogy, an Australian analogy, like the big bushfire that eliminates the underbrush that the government forbade landowners to use small fires to remove. The recession is an inevitable and a necessary phase of the business cycle. I'll say that again, inevitable and necessary phase. The bust rids the economy of the detritus, the distortions, the malinvestments, the junk that accumulated during the boom. Resources that have been put to unprofitable, unproductive uses, not least by governments, their regulations, their laws, etc., must either be shifted to sectors where genuine demand exists or be liquidated. Clearly, the cleanup takes time. This requires reorganization, shifting resources from A to B, liquidating resources, and so on. This means, yes, indeed, it means unemployment rises. It means that plant and equipment lies idle before it's moved to another purpose or scrapped. It means that financial resources will be used to repay debt or parked in very short-term sorts of instruments rather than invested in long-term projects. Point, it seems to me, the critical point to Austrians, the recession, the unemployment, and the like are not consequences of austerity. They're the results of the stimulus that generated the boom. Because of that, the worst possible thing to do post the boom is to try to prolong it, to reignite it, to start it, to stimulate. Whatever you do, avoid stimulus like the plague. During the recession caused by stimulus, in other words, they should avoid further stimulus. When the unfortunate member of your family who has a drinking problem comes to you, the worst thing you want to do is to send him on another blinder. Eventually, that's going to kill him. Right? The worst possible thing to do for drug addiction is to inject an even bigger dose of heroin into the veins. It might provide a very temporary, quote, stimulus. Alas, the long-term result is an extremely ugly and painful death. These sorts of things don't delay recovery. In sufficiently large doses, they kill. Stimulus also creates a climate of legal uncertainty, or uncertainty with respect to property rights, uncertainty with respect to what on earth are the government up to, what are they doing? We just don't know. As Robert Higgs would say, capitalists go on strike because they fear for the security of their property. In short, Keynesians and Austrians recommend diametrically opposite prescriptions in order to combat financial and economic crisis. Keynesians demand more of the same, redouble your spending, intensify the debt, more intervention, the more the merrier. Austrians, on the other hand, recommend that expenditure be slashed, revenue be slashed, legislation be slashed, debt be slashed. Okay. Having set the stage then with two, it seems to me, irreconcilable diagnoses of the problem and prescription for the cure, let's proceed then to a definition. I'll use one that's adopted by, I'll kind of adhere to laziness here. I don't read the Financial, well, I skim it, I seldom read it. It is a pinko sort of a publication. The Financial Times lexicon, quote, austerity measures, it says, quote, refer to official actions taken by the government during a period of adverse economic conditions to reduce its budget deficit using a combination of spending cuts or tax rises. And it asserts much as does Paul Krugman and his acolytes and followers. Various austerity measures have been announced since the global recession in 2008 and the Eurozone crisis in 2009. Operative word being announced. Drastically simplifying then, in terms of what I'll subsequently say, two indicators of austerity. The government's budget deficit and its debt, both expressed as a percentage of GDP, decrease. And for attentive listeners, as you no doubt are, notice I'm using this very statist sort of a notion, gross domestic product with respect to the United States in the 20s, gross national product. I'll explain myself in Rothbardian terms if I can use innately statist concepts in data to refute the claims of statists. That's my justification for so doing. It is alleged then by the mainstream that the lower the deficit, and I don't fundamentally disagree with that part, the lower the deficit, that's to say the higher the surplus expressed as a percentage of GDP, and the more the shrinkage of debt, the more austere is that should be government's, the S is slopped over, the more austere is the government's policy. Lower the deficit, higher the surplus expressed as a percentage of GDP, and the more the shrinkage of debt, that is genuine austerity. Before I proceed to my main notion of data, actually I'm skipping a bit too further ahead. I'll get to the chart in just a minute. There's a moral, and I think a vitally important moral dimension here. It seems to me austerity, by any sensible conception of the term, means not just that the government tempers, but that it abandons its profligacy. In kind of mathematical terms, we're not talking about a negative second derivative. We're not talking about a situation where the rate of growth of expenditure and of debt decelerates. We're talking about a situation, the first derivative becomes negative. That's to say, in absolute terms, expenditure shrinks, debt shrinks. It doesn't mean kind of a gentle, temporary, modest little tug at the fiscal belt. It means yanking as hard as is necessary to live within one's means, whether it's a household or whether it's the state. Austerity means that when a government figuratively stands in a doctor's surgery and the GP honestly says, you're fat, you're lazy, you're stupid, you've got to pull your life into shape, what that does not mean is that you rush out with the credit card and buy even bigger trousers. What it means is that you shred the credit card, figuratively speaking, and that you fit into smaller clothing. Right? We're talking austerity along those sorts of lines. As a minimum, it seems to me, austerity worthy of the name means that the government eliminates its deficit, for a starter. More ambitiously, it means that both the deficit turns into surplus, and it means that debt, both as a percentage of GDP and indeed in absolute terms, falls. What I'm alluding to is a situation where the basic situation of households and of the state, it seems to me, is comparable. Quote, what is prudence in the conduct of every private family, wrote Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, can scarce be folly in that of a great kingdom. Keynesians vehemently deny that proposition. The government, almost in Augustinian terms, sits on a totally different plane. It is simply exempt from the laws of common sense, never mind the laws of economics and of physics, etc. Somehow the government sits, as far as Keynesians are concerned, on a different plane. That government simply need not live within, certainly not their means, or indeed in any means. Quote from James Galbraith, whom I'm told is not a relative of John Galbraith. He wrote in 2010, quote, it may seem like homely wisdom to say that, just like the family, the government can't live beyond its means. But it's not, according to him. In these matters, the public and private sectors differ on a very basic point. Your family needs income in order to pay its debts. The government does not. It actually says your government does not, which is even worse. With government, the risk of non-payment simply does not exist. Government spends money and pays interest simply by typing numbers into a computer. He quite literally says this. Unlike private debtors, government does not need to have cash on hand. No government can ever be forced to default on debts in a currency it controls. Public defaults happen only when governments don't control the currency in which they owe debts, as Argentina owed dollars or as Greece now owes euros. But for the true sovereign, and we know whom he's referring to there, bankruptcy is an irrelevant concept. When President Obama says, even offhand, that the United States is, quote, out of money, unquote, he's talking nonsense. Dangerous nonsense. One wonders whether he believes it. Nor is public debt a burden on future generations. It doesn't have to be repaid, and in practice it never will be repaid. To be fair to the mainstream, if one goes through introductory texts, Greg Mankiw's is an example, both freshwater Chicagoans and saltwater Cambridge types at Harvard and Yale and MIT, few of them will take things to this extreme. If you go to faculties of economics and kind of middle-range institutions, people vehemently believe this. It is simply impossible for the US government to become bankrupt. Even thinking that exposes one to ridicule. Clearly you're a mental case if you can possibly think such a thing. It's a very Soviet sort of a thought, by the way, to someone with whom you disagree. You've got a mental problem. Stalin did that. If you can't argue a point on the basis of logic and evidence, you allege mental shortcomings in your opponent. As I say, that's a Stalinist tactic. It's not a libertarian tactic. My only question then, and I put this question and I get blank replies to it, if Galbraith is right, and if they really believe that, why does any government ever levy any taxes? Why didn't it work in Zimbabwe? Why didn't it work in Serbia in the mid-1990s? Why didn't it work in Weimar, Germany? Why doesn't the government simply borrow whatever it damn well pleases year after year after year, without limit and without any worry? I've never received a reply to that question. Let me return now to my graph, or beginning graph. I recognize probably for folks in the front as well as the back, they're largely illegible, so I'll give you a Cook's tour. My first, not really tongue-in-cheek, but it is a serious point. Austerity simply doesn't exist in Europe for a couple of reasons. I've put in figure 1 the ratio of government's surplus or deficit. There are virtually all deficits, by the way, except for a wee surplus in Germany, of EU members in roughly June of this year. For extremely sharp-eyed people, which I'm not even with my glasses and standing closest, I think there's 27, 28 countries in the EU. I've had to chop for a couple of reasons, the smallest ones for a semi-legible graph. The critical point, under the Maastricht Treaty passed in 91-92, basically a condition of entry for new countries into the EU, two things. A budget surplus of a deficit, basically, as a percentage of GDP, less than 3%, and a debt-to-GDP ratio of less than 60%. The point I'm making here is that with respect to that first criterion, most of the EU, in terms of the big countries, fail that first test. There can be no austerity if your budget deficit is on the scale of, say, Spain's at 10%, of the UK at 6%, France 4 point something, what's that other big countries? The interesting point, by the way, only one surplus country, Germany, and you need a microscope to see it. The smallest budgetary deficit countries in the EU are basically Scandinavian and Nordic countries, not least of which is Sweden, which over the years has got plenty of stick. I've only glanced at it. In the most recent edition of The Free Market from the Mises Institute is, at first glance, an exceedingly good article about Sweden cutting debt, cutting deficits, etc., and doing commensurately better than other European countries. But the smallest deficits, Estonia, Sweden, Luxembourg, Latvia, Finland. The biggest one, obviously, is Spain, as I said, 10% plus. Greece is just on 10%. The Irish Republic, just below 8%. Portugal, pigs countries. But close on the heels of the pigs comes the UK, France, what else? Mid-range would be countries like Poland, Belgium, Denmark, and so on. And as I say, I've had to chop a few. The average, though, being about 4% of GDP, the average EU country at the moment violates that criterion. The average EU country wouldn't, by that criterion, be eligible for membership. And so it is with respect to the ratio of government debt to GDP in roughly June of this year. The lowest ratios, Estonia, Luxembourg, Sweden, once again, the same countries at about 50% or less. The biggest one by a margin, no big surprise there. Greece at pushing 160%, Italy 140-something, Portugal, Ireland, Belgium, UK, France, Germany is up there at 80%. The average EU country violates that second Maastricht criterion, and indeed all of the big ones, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. So in that sense, if meeting your treaty commitments is an indicator of some sort of a sense of financial well-being. None of them meet that. How can there be austerity if the average EU country simply isn't meeting those treaty obligations? The paradigmatic example of proper, true austerity is the United States in the Depression of 1920-21. Many Americans haven't heard of it. Perhaps you haven't heard of it either. Why not? Probably because it lasted such a short period of time, 9 months to 1 year. Why did it last such a short period of time? Well, because the government, as I'll now mention, implemented genuine austerity. Similar situation, not to the same extent, existed in Canada as well, but even fewer people know about the Canadian Depression of the early 1920s than the American one, so I'll stick with the United States. Here we have the GN, Gross National Product, that's its compiled by the official statistics in the Commerce Department, between 1916-23 and 1928-1935, and I've standardized them to be 100 in the first year. So it's 2 7-year periods. And the point I want to bring to your attention is the decrease in GNP in the United States between years 5 and 6, namely between 1920 and 1921. GNP in the United States fell by, a drumroll please, 24% within the space of a single year. Within the space of a single year, gross national product fell by more than it did in the first 3 years of the Great Depression. The single worst year, economically speaking, if your criterion is GNP, was not in the 1930s, it was in the 1920s. Right? Another point is looking at the subsequent increase of GNP between 21 and 22. It rose by, 21 and 22 by something like 7%, and between 22 and 23 by about 15%. Not even China in the past decade has managed that. So we have a conundrum for the Keynesians. The single worst year by a country mile in the 20th century, the Depression of 1920-21, was followed by the most robust recovery in American history. Why is that? I assert unto thee, genuine austerity. As you can well imagine, during the First World War in the United States, expenditure exploded from something like $700 billion in 1916 to a maximum of pushing, what's that, about 18-point-something billion in 1919. Afterwards, notice how expenditure collapses. Between 1919 and the nadir of the Depression, government expenditure, the US federal government's expenditure fell by, a drum roll please, 81%. Right? In the space between 1919, 1922. Revenue didn't rise nearly as much as expenditure, as we'll see in just a minute, gargantuan budget deficit, but it was replaced by, if you look very carefully, the revenue line is now greater than the expenditure line. Titanic deficits very quickly replaced by budget surpluses, which you can see here, expressed as a percentage of America's GNP. In 1916, a balanced budget. 1917, small deficit. 18 and 19, 14%, which is in kind of Greek or Spanish territory over the past couple of years. Between 1919 and 1920, a monumental shift from a huge deficit to a surplus. And in the single worst year, economically speaking, in the United States, between 1920 and 1921, the budget surplus increased and then continued to increase through the early and mid-1920s. That's genuine austerity. And if harking back to the figure about the increase of GNP during 22 and 23, it was genuine austerity which then created the situation for a robust, a genuine recovery. Whilst all this is happening, what's happening to America's debt? Well, during the First World War, as you can expect, and given those deficits, it exploded from 5% of GNP in 1916 to a high of 30% by 1919. And admittedly, if you're looking very carefully, it does increase in 1920-21. My guess, and it's only a guess, I haven't had the time to investigate, there are timing issues between generating a budget surplus and then in a subsequent financial year repaying debt. But notice how it decreases. Alas, it doesn't fall to its pre-First World War level. This is kind of a Robert Higgs point. There's a ratchet effect. Alas, the size of government in absolute terms doesn't shrink to its pre-World War level. but it does shrink relative to that at the apex of the war. So we have a dramatic shrinkage on the order of 80% of expenditure. Revenue fell by half. In other words, they're cutting taxes, they're eliminating taxes, they're slashing regulations, and debt falls. We turn now, goodness gracious me, to the EU, and I've kicked in recent American data as well. For folks in the back, it's a messy graph, I recognize that. First criterion of genuine austerity, budget deficits as a percentage of domestic product, GDP this time, in the EU and the US between 2005 and 2012. I've chopped the EU into a couple of categories which slightly overlap. Major EU, the first category is Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. Non-major EU is not major and not pigs. And who are the pigs? Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain. And notice the overlap that Spain is in both the pigs category and the major category. You're welcome to fiddle with the data if you please. My impression, it doesn't make, from a substantive point of view, it doesn't make a difference. What do we see? In broad terms, oh, and we've got the US federal government in the solid dots. Between 2005 and 2008, there is indeed, generally speaking, a shrinkage of deficits. They're all in deficit, but the size of the deficit relative to GDP falls. In 2008, 2009, there are gargantuan deficits. Notice then, in effect, the welfare state today is fighting, from a budgetary point of view, a war equivalent to the First World War that the United States fought between the America's entry in the war in 1917 and the end of the war in financial terms ended on the battlefield in late 1918, in financial terms in 1919. What Krugman seems to be talking about in so-called austerity, yes, indeed, since 2009, the extent of budget deficits have shrunk somewhat from gargantuan levels to merely huge levels. But notice that the extent of the profligacy today is still, on average, considerably greater than it was in 2005, 2006, 2007, pre-crisis. Governments today, in a time, according to Krugman, of so-called austerity, are more profligate than they were, far more profligate than they were for 2007. So if Krugman didn't complain about this austerity, on what basis can he possibly complain, the so-called austerity but before 2008, on what possible basis can he whinge about it since 2009? Here I've chopped the pigs into their component categories, namely Portugal, the Irish Republic, Italy, Greece, and Spain. And the picture there is, well, much the same as I've just now painted it to you. There was a couple of exceptions, so that, for example, the Irish Republic ran some surpluses in 2005, 6, and 7. They went to a deficit. They're fighting something like the First World War times 2, a deficit of 30% of GDP, which is now improved, halved to merely 15% of GDP in 2012. In financial terms, they're still fighting the First World War. Greece, not fundamentally different. It's always been in deficit. Deficit shrank, and this so-called improvement of its deficit, which is now on the order of, 8 to 10% of GDP, is only marginally more profligate, but they've been profligate all the way through. If that's austerity, then that's an extremely odd definition of austerity. Debt to GDP, it rises. You can slice the data, you can dice the data, you can do them whatever you please, you can put this color and that color, you can adjust the font, you can turn it upside. Debt is rising. Not just in the US. Notice now the extent of the debt in the extent to which the US had a lean and trim government, those days are long past. And I'll take Jeffrey Tucker's point, whether we ever see them again is for more intelligent heads than mine. But America's debt now is on the level basically of the pigs. On the order of, what's that, about the average of the pigs, about 110, 115% of GDP, and America is hot at their heels. You name it, you slice the data, as I say, debt is rising. Essential component of austerity is debt is, if you have an austere policy, therefore debt will fall. Debt ain't falling, therefore the policy is not austere. I look at the pigs, and again, you can slice the data, you can dice them, you can do what you please. Debt is considerably higher today, 2012, I should say, than it was 2005, 6, 7. The least egregious exception to that would be Italy, in which it's risen modestly. In the Irish Republic, for example, it's exploded from quite modest levels, and I'll return to this point, to kind of European standard levels today. This graph superimposes data from the United States between 1916 and 1923 with America today and European countries. And it just brings that contrast onto a single graph. America fought its First World War on the order of a budget deficit of 15% of GDP, and notice how it subsequently, very rapidly, very sharply returned to a surplus position, and the European countries not within a country mile of that. Modest retreat from 2009, but not particularly anything to write home about. America recovered during these years, 22, 23, 24, and so on. Europe sits in the doldrums. Why? Because quite literally, this big fat government is standing in the way. It's blocking the road. Similar point, major, non-major. I've sliced the data. I've diced them. Deficits, debt, they're rising. They're not falling. This is a point I want to bring to your attention. This focuses on the Irish Republic, which I'm interested in for reasons I'll mention in just a minute, and Australia. Notice that the Commonwealth's debt, and this is kind of the Wayne Swan propaganda point, yes, indeed, the Commonwealth of Australia's debt as a percentage of GDP by international standards is quite low. What he never ever says is that if you take local council debt plus state government debt plus household and corporate debt and compare apples with apples, Australia is in effect as heavily leveraged as America is or Europe is. Its government less so, its households more so. In Ireland, basically as a result of bank bailouts, what was a relatively, by European standards or by EU standards, a low ratio of debt, which is on the order of 30-something%, has now exploded above 100%. Why do I say this? Let me let Alan Kohler do my lifting for me. Now, a quote. Alan Kohler is an interesting fish. Occasionally, you get the impression he might just be getting it. I quote, 5 years ago yesterday, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy, he said on the 16th of September in Business Spectator. The question now is, what, if anything, was learnt, and has enough been done to prevent the same thing happening again, as it periodically has through history? The answer is, a drum roll please, nothing and no. This is Alan Kohler, remember. A banking crisis will definitely happen again, and he's referring to Australia. The banks themselves, in Oz, are bigger and more powerful than ever. The banking industry is even more concentrated than it was then, especially in the United States and Australia. How big are banks in Oz? Bloody big. I give you an example. The market capitalization in billions of dollars, I've taken the 4 biggest banks in Australia, the 4 biggest in the EU, and the 4 biggest in the US, and this is on the 15th of November. Of that collection then of 12 banks, Wells Fargo, an American bank, market cap $225 billion. HSBC of the UK, just over $200 billion. JP Morgan, just over $200 billion. Bank of America, 150. Citigroup, 150. Commonwealth Bank of Australia, 125. Westpac, 100. Santander of Spain, what's that, 100. BNP Paribas of France, 80-ish, 90-ish. ANZ, 90-ish. NAB, 80-ish. And Barclays of the UK, 60, 65. How big are Australian banks? They're as big as the biggest American and European banks. The US, depending on how you count its population, legal, illegal, etc., in round figures, a population of 300 million. The EU, in round terms, 320, 330 million. Australia, 22, 23 million, and Australian banks are as big as American and European banks. That, it seems to me, is a recipe for big problems. How big are Australian banks? I say unto thee, bloody big, bigger than German banks. Capitalization of the Commonwealth, Westpac, ANZ, NAB. Deutsche Bank, the biggest in Germany, market capitalization of less than 50 billion as of the 15th of November. Länderbank Baden-Württemberg, being slightly naughty, it's not technically speaking a listed entity. I'm making an inference on its shareholders' equity if it were a listed entity, and taking the average of Commerzbank and Deutsche, and DZ, which is not listed either. How big are Australian banks? They're much bigger than German banks. The Federal Republic of Germany, in round figures, 80 million people. Commonwealth of Australia, in round terms, 22 million people. Is it a good thing to have such big bloody banks? I say unto thee, it is not. I'll skip a bit in my notes, because I'm beginning to run a bit short on time. It simply can't happen in Australia, say the pundits. Prudential regulation, they say, they never say why, but they just say APRA is somehow better than the Financial Services Authority of the UK. Banks in this country didn't issue low doc or poor quality loans. I won't steal the thunder of a subsequent speaker, but, well, that's not really so. The Achilles heel, it seems to me, and I've written about it, some agree, some disagree, that's fine, but let's not cast aspersions about mental illness and so on. Let's stick to the facts and the evidence. Fractional reserve banks and central banks are the Achilles heel of an economy and a financial system. What happens when the inherent and inevitable bankruptcy comes to light? Well, recent experience tells us the banks get a bailout. What happens when they get a bailout? Debt to GDP zooms. It zoomed in Ireland from circa 25 to 30% to above 100%. As and when it happens in Australia, it seems to me the risk is that much the same will happen here. So I'll conclude. We find austerity everywhere except in the statistics. There's an article recently written by, can't see it in my notes now, wrong lenses in the specs. You can look it up in the, if you want. Quote, taking a close look at the actual stats available from Eurostat on the PIGS countries plus Cyprus, one finds little empirical evidence that the governments there, and I insert, or in the EU more generally, have de facto reduced their total public expenditures. This is in stark contrast to the current austerity debate. It's like a unicorn, it's like Father Christmas, it's like all sorts of things. The tooth fairy, people talk about it, but, or Tasmanian tiger, there might be sightings, but there is no confirmed corroborative evidence of the existence of austerity either. My second conclusion, and I know that I'm running up against time, Keynes was, and Krugman is, wrong, and the Austrians have been correct all along. So said a friend of mine, Martin Maas, earlier this year, Keynesians will of course regret that even larger increases of government borrowing and deficit spending, that these things haven't occurred. These things, which certainly have marked the state's finances during the past few years, have been implemented in order to stimulate the economy. But from an Austrian perspective, bloated governments and higher taxes help to explain why, several years after the financial crisis, American and European economies are still in the doldrums. So this country, what Europe, what America desperately needs to get out of the doldrums, or what America did in the immediate wake of the First World War. So I'll stop there, and thank you again for the invitation.
We're just going to speak up. We have time for maybe one or two questions. Vinay?
Hi, good morning. Just going back to your figure 14 and 15, where you compared the size of the Australian banks.
Yep.
On a market cap basis.
Yep.
But presumably when you calculate like the blowout in Ireland's debt, and you sort of say that the same thing could happen to Australia. Is it a more relevant number, and it's the number you may have used, is either the amount of the total debt issued by these banks or just the depositor debt issued by the banks? Because that's what the bailout is going to cover. It's not going to cover the market cap.
I'll slightly disagree with that last sentence. The answer to the Germain Party question, I don't know. You're happy to try other criteria. It seems to me, pick a criterion, be it assets, be it shareholders' equity, be it market cap. Australian banks are big banks, and it's difficult to avoid that conclusion. The bailouts have been thus far, and this is your last point, I would dispute the point, the bailouts have been bailouts basically of bondholders, and if anything, it's been depositors in their role as taxpayers, there's an overlap there, who've taken the brunt of the hit. So in the sense I agree with you, is it going to be shareholders' equity that's bailed out? Well, in America to some extent, in Europe to a lesser extent, given the number of superannuants who quite literally rely upon their Commonwealth Bank dividends, it's a guess, and your guess is as good as mine. Joe Hockey, if he's the treasurer whoever's going to be the treasurer, his first attempt is going to be a bailout of shareholders' equity. That's a guess, and others will have better guesses than mine.
It's interesting that the conventional wisdom is that Japan has been mired in deflation for 20 years, but look what this has done to their car industry. Their cars are the best in the world and they're affordable. So I think that the idea that they've been in deflation demonstrates what a wonderful thing deflation can be. I know they've had other issues with infrastructure.
Yes. Just a 2-second response. If deflation were such an awful thing, as Keynesians implies, Bill Gates would be among the poorest people on the planet. Surely the cost of computing has plummeted over the past, of storage, of oomph, and people know computing here, and I certainly don't, but surely the cost of computing has reduced drastically over the past 20 or 30 years, and it seems to me it by and large has not done too much damage to his net worth. So I would say it's beyond the scope, and I know others want to ask questions, but it seems to me that deflation by and large is a good thing. When we walk into a supermarket, we rejoice at lower prices, and we chagrin at higher prices.
Well, we have time for one more question.
In your analysis of the Australian banking market, you skipped over the massive, unheard of bank guarantee. I understood there's only one other country in the world that had that. That was Ireland, in fact. So in fact, the Australian government guaranteed 100% of all bank assets, and they're able to, of course, the big majors in their overseas trading desks were to take advantage of that, and it was massively impact on the competitive market here. I would argue there's only been a bailout.
Oh, beg your pardon. I won't dispute the characterization. Yep.
All righty, would you join me in thanking Chris?
Thank you.